Welcome, everybody. We're just going to, actually, it's time to start. We are starting now. Thank you so much for being on today with us. This is Jennifer Coffey from OSEP, and you also heard Len Hatfield on with us. He organizes us, and he does a fantastic job of it. So thank you, Len, for making it all happen. Today, we will be talking about your annual performance report, but I'm not going to be doing so much of nuts and bolts of annual performance reports because you all have had grants for at least for the last 2 years, many of you much more. So we do have some new folks who have taken over positions in states. And so for them, I am willing to do a separate webinar. And what would be helpful is if you would go ahead and put your information in the chat, or it might be even easier just to email me. You should know my email, but just in case you don't, go ahead and send me an email if you are new staff and you would like a more in-depth sharing of how to create an annual performance report, also known as a continuation report. And I toggle back and forth with terms because many of the people here have something to do with the APR for the other side of OSEP, the MSIP side, the Monitoring State Improvement Planning side, so your SPP APR. And so I know that can be confusing, and so I do try to use continuation report sometimes as well, so people aren't too confused. So let's get to the slides, and we'll do the slideshow from the beginning. So again, just go ahead and email me if you would like a separate webinar. I also, if I couldn't get a shared time across people who are interested in going more in depth, I can also record something and just make that available for you. I recorded a few years back, but you know, it's nice to update every once in a while. So let's see, I had not looked at the chat. But Len, if you'll just let me know if there's anything in the chat while I'm going through, that would be great.
Will do.
All right, so things that we will cover today. What's new in APR requirements? Some opportunities for feedback for you, program measure considerations, and completing your APR. Now, again, I'm not going to go too in depth because most of you have had grants for a while when it comes to just the basics of completing an APR form. The 524B form, but I will talk a little bit about it at the end if we have time. And I'm going to try to get into some things with your form that people, especially with directions for the explanation or the description section under your status charts and for sections B and C, I think sometimes people forget to look back at the directions and don't give us the answers that we need in those sections, so I'll focus mostly on that when it comes to the APR section. All right, so in the what's new area, we have some changes this year to Section C, and I'll get into that, but just a reminder, Section C comes after Section B, of course, Section B being the budget, Section C being more talking about the partnerships and things that have changed with your grant. Again, there are directions for it, but also we have 2 new directions for Section C this year of information that you should be providing in that section. Upcoming changes to Program Measure 1. When I say upcoming, that means next year you will have changes to Program Measure 1, and so I wanted to update you on that. And then we also expect to have changes to Program Measure 2 next year, and we expect to have a new long-term measure. So I'll be speaking about all those things. And then talking about when to submit your draft program measures to your project officer. So your APR Section C instructions says in Section C, please provide information about how school, district, regional, as appropriate. It says as appropriate because not every state has a regional provider, a regional ESDs, ISDs, et cetera, whatever they happen to be called, professional development provider. So that's why it's as appropriate. If you're early childhood, those words are going to look a little different too. But the various entities that help you deliver your professional development, how are state implementation teams used within these different entities for your initiatives? In Section C, please provide a description of how you work with local entities examples here being schools and districts to plan for sustainability. So the first requirement about implementation teams, I'm going to get into a description of why implementation teams are important. Hopefully most of you know this, but it's good to be reminded because you do the training, the professional development, the explaining in your state, and it's always nice to be reminded of the rationale so that you can pass that on when you're talking about, when you're preparing people maybe at the state level to support implementation teams or supporting the implementation teams themselves. Effective implementation teams, so what makes a team effective? Some of the purposes, so some of the roles they can play, how you support teams, resources about implementation teams, and then I'll have time for questions as well. So implementation teams, where do they sit within the active implementation frameworks? So this is CSEP, uses the active implementation frameworks, and the implementation teams are the who. So up here on the left, these connected implementation teams are the who that get the work done. There is some research to say that it can take 14 years to fully implement something without implementation teams and 2 years, 2.5 years actually with implementation teams. It's really initial research, but kind of interesting. So the first poll question for you, and you can use your phone or use the chat pod, how do you use implementation teams within your SPDIG work? Oops, did not mean to do that. Did mean to do this. And then if you could just tell me what you see in the chat pod, I'm just having trouble bringing it up.
Will do.
Thank you.
Nothing yet.
If you do not use implementation teams, you might want to say that as well, just so I know somebody is there.
Melissa Hanish says, review data, propose aligned action steps, monitor progress. Cindy Medici says, we have district level, school level, and instructional level teams. Trying to get them to communicate well across the team is a challenge, across teams.
Great. Excellent. Thank you. And I was finally able to get it up. So
Oh, good.
Thank you very much. Great. Well, thank you, those of you who weighed in on that. So implementation teams, what makes them effective, or what can help them to be more effective, I should say. And this is from a paper by Will Aldridge and colleagues. So effective implementation teams are comprised of at least 3 to 5 individuals, and those individuals should have experience managing systems changes, working on database improvements, and using the data to support implementation of the initiative. Effective implementation teams incorporate expertise in the chosen intervention, and as well as using implementation science, which all of you are well aware of, are closely supported by and linked to executive leaders in the community prevention system. So obviously the Aldridge article is not about school systems, but it does translate very well to the school system. So executive leaders in your case could be the state director of special education, could be the superintendent of education at the state level. If you have a regional system, there's still going to be superintendents of those and leaders of those. And then at the district level, you have a superintendent. You get my point. Those are the executive leaders, the people who can hopefully make decisions because they should be using your data to make those decisions. So the team feeds information up to those leaders. And then the team, effective teams are responsible for ensuring the cross-system and day-to-day leadership and coordination functions. So there does need to be some leadership to be successful. If you get that triangle from CSEP in your mind and leadership being the base of it, and then coordinating, you know, are you making sure things are all working together? So some purposes of implementation teams, they monitor implementation. Part of how they do that is through reviews of fidelity. They make decisions concerning training and coaching. and they can use the Fidelity data to do that as well. They ensure that there is the necessary structural features for your initiatives. So do you need to change job duties? Do you have to think about caseload size? Do your coaches have the ability to reach all the schools they're supposed to get to? Do you have substitutes when people have to go to trainings? Is the daily schedule set up so students can receive the interventions? Those are the kinds of structural features. They ensure that there are adequate resources available for implementation, and that can start, of course, if you think about the hexagon tool that people use in exploration stage, that's when you talk about, are we going to have enough resources to implement this? And then throughout the life of the grant, deciding if there are adequate resources. And then aligning other agency practices to be consistent and supportive of the evidence-based practices. And I'm going to get a little bit more into this when I talk about sustainability. The other new question for Section C, this is a start with implementation teams. And then formulating solutions to obstacles. So you're going to have challenges. What are the solutions to those challenges? And the team can figure that out. Linked implementation teams. These are linked in terms of sharing data and information with each other. So the information flows down. Oops, didn't mean to do that. Flows down, say, the state level, to the regional, to the district, to the school. If you're early childhood, you can think of the entities that work in the same way. And then it flows back up. The school data and the school information about challenges or what's working well flows up as well to the district, the region, to the state. It goes both ways. Why do we need implementation teams? Because they support full implementation and sustainability. And here are the articles that support that. They support consistent and meaningful communication related to the initiative. And they respond to common challenges, challenges of turnover. So if we just have one person really leading something and they leave, it's pretty much over. If you have a team of people who are knowledgeable, they can stand the loss of one member. For diffuse knowledge. So think about multi-tiered systems of support, MTSS. You have to know the different interventions that are being used at the targeted and intensive levels. You need to know about the core curriculum and instructional practices to use. You need to know about the assessments that are used for screening, for progress monitoring, for outcomes. So a lot of knowledge you have to have, behavioral knowledge, again, implementation science, how to use data. And so if you have, say, 5 people on a team, you're going to be able to choose people that have that knowledge and bring it to the team. Increased opportunities for collaboration. Collaboration is really important in the school research, that if teachers are able to collaborate, they're more likely to be successful and student outcomes are improved. So this is one way to build collaboration at the school level, but all the other levels as well, so that one office might know what the other office is doing, etc. And then connecting the initiative to leadership. That team is able to bring leadership information about what's happening in the day-to-day so that leaders can make decisions. Effective use of implementation teams. Georgia's evidence-based professional development worksheet is on our program measures page. If you download these slides, which are on our event page today, that is, you can see it's a hyperlink, and you can go to the program measure page, or you can just go to the program measure page on your own on the SIG network, and you'll see that they talk about implementation teams on there. In your APR, measuring team effectiveness. This is what it might look like. I pulled it from another report, not Georgia's. 6 months after initial participation in the tertiary behavior supports professional development, 80% of tertiary behavior supports teams will be implementing evidence-based tertiary behavior practices as identified through coaches' document review. So this is a great SMART measure in terms of being able to assess whether or not they're successful, who's going to be doing the work, etc. And then there's also the Kentucky example. This is not in an APR. This is on CSUP's website, but Kentucky's work with active implementation, they describe their use of teams in this brief. So some resources to help you support teams. And again, these are hyperlinks, so if you pull down the PowerPoint, you'll have access to it. Systems coaching. So Florida MTSS has determined these are the things that systems coaches need to be able to do. And they support teams, the systems coaches. The team functioning scale from Amy Gummer Erickson and Patty Noonan and the team initiated problem solving from Ann Todd and others at the PBIS Center. And then there are also implementation team look forwards from CSUP. And there's a team fidelity measure used for action planning. Effective teams have to function well together, and that sometimes means having really good structures for them to function with, having goals, and then using the action planning to talk about what they need to do in their next meeting. So it's just, it needs to be structured time, and these are some of the things that help people look at how their teams are functioning and how to structure their time. Implementation team resources, CSUP has a module. You can see this is the web address down here. And then there's also improvement cycles module, which implementation teams play a big role in. Other resources, communication protocols. So we talked about how information should flow down the educational system and up the educational system, and the communication protocols help people have agreements of what's going to be communicated when and how people should be responding to that. Building implementation teams. This helps the building implementation team know some of their activities that they should be engaging in, and the district's implementation team as well. So do you think any of these resources, so they're the team scales I shared, and then the modules, and then the various implementation team checklists, etc., do you think any of these resources, including the team scales, will be helpful for you? If yes, which ones? And you can do this in the chat pod or use your phone. And if you're already using one, you can let us know about that too. Oops. There we go. Great. Good. So some of you had already, it looks like, had already talked about your teams playing some of these, or engaging some of these roles and functions. Good. District implementation checklist. And did anyone want to, I thought I heard someone on the phone. I don't want to cut anyone off. And someone's using the Florida Systems coaching tool for their use. Great. If you know me at all, you know I love efficiency, and using somebody else's work that's publicly available is a fantastic way to be efficient. Great. All right, moving on. Questions about implementation teams. So anything that you're wondering about how to respond in section C, and I'm going to stop doing that. So let's not look at my schedule and instead look at, this is your Dear Colleague letter that you received from Larry Wexler. And you can see section B and C. This is in the Dear Colleague section before his signature. That it says in section C, and so this is where you're going to find the directions. I just wanted to let you know where to look for those. Okay, so any questions about that? How you're going to respond in your APR, or what we mean by implementation teams, or anything related? Okay, great. Hearing none. Oh, maybe one. Could our leadership teams also act as implementation teams? Yeah, I think the question here, Brandy, it's a good question. And I think if you look back on those slides and it talks about what makes up an effective team, what their roles would be, I think then you could determine if your leadership team is acting as an implementation team. That would be a start. You can also look through the materials, the implementation team resources I put up, and it talks about what they do, and then you could also measure that against your leadership teams and see if they are true implementation teams. Okay, great. Thank you for your question. All right, so the second question that or the second request that we've made is also in section C, please provide a description of how you work with local entities, for example, schools or districts, to plan for sustainability. So I think we all know why we care about sustainability, but it's always good to be reminded that 70% of new large-scale initiatives fail, typically flawed execution, right? It's all in the implementation. We know that. We don't want to be that 70%. And I consider failing if it doesn't stick around after the grant ends, right? Because it maybe help for a little while, but it's not going to help for maybe the period of time that's necessary. So we want full implementation, and then we want things to stick around. All right, so here is an example of the way things used to be done. If you ever were a teacher in a school, this probably looks a bit familiar to you, or a principal in a school. This is what it can feel like if there's not more cohesion in what's being delivered from the district to the school, and sometimes from the state to the district level. And all these slides that I'm going to be talking about next are from Kent McIntosh's presentation to us in 2015. I think they are still valuable and still meaningful even in 2020. And he let me borrow them. So planning for sustainability. First, we got to figure out what do we mean by sustainability. And if you do any Google searches, what you have is around environmental sustainability. It's a little bit harder to get to educational sustainability, but that's what we're talking about. What are some of the impacts of planning for sustainability, considerations and components, and thinking through the sites you're working with and some resources for you. So first question is, what do you think sustainability is? I'll share a definition. It's not the only definition, but first I want to hear what's your thinking on sustainability. What is it? I almost gave away the answer there. And I can hear somebody's phone, so unless you want to answer the question, if you could please mute. Initiatives are sustained when they become the way of doing the work. I love that. Simple and effective. Continuation of program activities components that are effective, ensuring that structures are in place to support continuation. Fantastic. Great. Thank you both. Practices that endure and become part of professional practice and transcend changes in leadership. Lovely. And then an initiative continues to exist once outside support is less or non-existent. These are all fantastic. Thank you so much. So the definition I'm using here from McIntosh and colleagues is durable implementation of a practice at a level of fidelity that continues to produce valued outcomes. So I'm going to get into a couple of, delve a little deeper into a couple of those terms. So fidelity of implementation, I think we feel pretty comfortable about that. We know where we assess it to, I think, but just to focus on that, because we're using an evidence-based practice, and it was tested as, it's tested in a certain way, and then it saw improvements in child outcomes because it was done a certain way. And so we're trying to do it that way again. It also, when you figure out how you're doing on intervention fidelity, it helps you know what to do, what you need to make changes with in your professional development, what to focus on, what areas can you improve upon. So these are some of the reasons you focus on intervention fidelity. So question, what state level actions do you think lead to sustainability of your initiative? So what do you think you can do from a state level that's going to help make your initiative more sustainable? And I think these are answers the previous answers from what sustainability is. So what actions can you take at the state level to help sustain your initiative? So aligning the initiative with various offices, divisions within the state, so aligning with other related activities, connection and alignment, and a lot of alignment. Continued access and availability of guidance and training. Great. Alignment with existing legislation, continuity of agency messaging. Highlight student outcomes. Build a strong infrastructure at the state level, duplicate the same with districts. Engage key leadership staff. These are fantastic answers, and the answers of people who are actually engaged in this work right now, you could tell. Great. Thank you, everyone. All right. So Kent McIntosh's research focused on PBIS, but I am fairly sure it can all be generalized. And some of it I know. My dissertation was on sustainability. It was a while ago at this point, so I have some background. I've done some reading since then. And so my understanding is that pretty much all of this can be generalized to other initiatives. So in his research, Kent McIntosh and colleagues found that states sustaining PBIS had state leadership teams, state-level trainers, and training curricula, a state recognition system, so which schools are doing a great job and what their outcomes are, and then regular use of the PBIS implementation blueprint to assess and inform implementation. And there's been some conversation about this. When I did my research, it was manualized programs that sometimes didn't have the sustainability that one would hope, and I think that was from a while ago. I think that was because the coaching wasn't there. There were some other things that weren't there. I think recently we're finding more and more that you kind of have to have something, it doesn't have to be paper, but something you can come back to and point to, this is the way it's done. So you have to have a playbook of some kind. Grant funding can be a threat to sustainability. And I'll let you, I won't ask a poll question, but just maybe get in your head for a second why grant funding in and of itself might mean that an initiative isn't sustained in a school and a district. So if you're just thinking about training the school and district personnel and you're not thinking about how the context has to change to support it, you're not thinking about the coaching that needs to take place. So if it's just the training, like we're going to go train them and then we're done, it's not going to do it. That you are hiring new people to do the work who will not have the financial support once your grant is over. And the firing part means like letting go would be more appropriate term. Once the grant ends, you're going to have to let them go. The project mentality. So, oh, great, we're doing the PBIS project. And once that grant ends, well, there's no PBIS project. It's over. So the 4 principles for sustaining PBIS, and these are specific to PBIS. It doesn't mean they can't be generalized, but this is something that is part of their playbook. And you're going to have your own principles for your initiative. But promote priority, ensure effectiveness, increase efficiency, use data for continuous regeneration. And we'll get into each of these. So priority is how important you show your initiative is in comparison to other practices. Priority is incorporating your initiative into other core system components of what's happening. So for example, if you have a literacy initiative, you're looking at schools and districts and you're thinking about how it is integrated into what's already happening in the school day. And then the connection to other initiatives. So if you have an academic MTSS and you have PBIS for behavior, and then you have a whole child initiative, those all have a lot of similarities and a lot of things you're trying to cover. So how are you, as many of you were saying, how are you aligning and figuring out how to make it coherent or integrating? How do you promote priority? You maximize visibility. And so presenting the data whenever you can, and especially to people with resources or decision-making power. describing the effects of abandoning support. So what would it mean if you no longer had this? There was a school, back when I was at University of Oregon, there was a school locally that had been doing PBIS for years. Principal left, new principal came in, they were going to stop doing PBIS. The parents, a bunch of family members got together and met with the principal and said, this is what PBIS has been doing for our students. We feel strongly that we want you to continue this. So you need to, it has to do with the data, it has to do with the feeling, it has to do with engaging families in that case. But what would happen if you abandoned support? Being able to tell that story. Getting it into written policy, if it's much harder to get rid of if it's already in written policy. That's not everything, but it's something. And then you already talked about braiding the project with other initiatives and showing how it can lead to outcomes for new initiatives. So principal support is important, and we sometimes have challenges getting to it. They don't have time to come to training or engage in online professional development. They don't have time to meet with coaches. These are all things that can happen. So principal academies have been really successful in PBIS, and that's for new administrators, or it might be if you are just now coming to a district in a school, then you're bringing in the principals to learn. Letting them know what their role is. What do we expect you to do? Here are some tools and resources to help you do that. What are the timelines, etc. Providing the coaching to the schools. These are things that the districts can do. They can support the coaching. Networking can also enhance principal support. So having informal conversations between principals where they get to just talk about, I'm having issues with this, or this is really working well. What are you doing about this? So site visits can engender that networking. And then helping the school staff demonstrate support. So not just the SPDIG people coming and saying, here's what's working for you, but helping them to tell their own story, because they'll be able to continue doing that after you leave. Steps in braiding initiatives. So we had a great presentation from Lynn Hold-Heidi last month, and I'm not going to do this as much justice as she did, but a big idea is there an outcome that we share, that we value and that we share? How can we help each other get to those goals? And then if there are things that people are bringing in that aren't helping you meet those goals that you've decided, with the school, the district are most important to them, it's just not worth it. We don't have a training we, as a very royal we, but there shouldn't be a training just because it feels good, just because people have heard that's a good trainer. It needs to help you reach that goal. And then finding common structures and language that can be integrated. So I've shared before that there was a state where there was coaching for various initiatives, and they figured out, we have coaching going on for both initiatives. Can we bring the coaching together and make that similar and learn about each other's initiatives at the same time and support them? Language is really important. If you're speaking a language people don't know, they tune out. So how can we have common language? Can we use teams? So in that example of having a whole child PBS MTSS school, could an implementation team function to support each of those if they worked together? And make your efforts public. So this could be newsletters, it could be to parents, it could be more broad than that, having monthly or quarterly reports. I've shared the Iowa Spotlight before from their SPDIG, and I think it's a monthly report, but it does a great job of bringing out the fidelity data, the impact data on students, and putting it together in a way that's really easy to pass on and tell their story. Formal presentations to the school board, to district administrators, to the PTA, to community agencies and businesses, and bring in the local news. There's nothing better than a local newspaper telling your success story. I think, was there a chat pod comment, Len? I can't get to it right now.
Let's see, after Lee Stickles' ability to align with current work and be open to the influence of new information, needs to be agile, connected, and generative.
Okay, so that might have been about the last question. Thank you. So what is effectiveness? The extent to which the practice results in desired outcomes. That's how we're defining effectiveness here. And effects must be attributed to the practice. And again, that's why the fidelity data are important, because we're doing this, we know we're doing this, and over time, this is how the student outcome has changed. And the more we do of this, the more the outcome changes. And you make that connection between fidelity improving and child outcomes improving. Ensuring effectiveness. So when we focus on fidelity of implementation, we talked about that, assessing it regularly, using it to enhance what you already do, and then again, connecting fidelity data with the outcome data, because we're all fidelity geeks at this point in time. We really want to know what's being done by the adults. Not everyone feels that way. Not everyone even knows what fidelity means. So just keep that in mind, that you still might have to be able to tell that story. And you want to grow when you're effective with MTSS, with PBIS, anything that is a tiered model of support. When you're effective, you're growing that green level, the group that is not at risk and not in need of intensive intervention. And then, this is what an effective school is going to look like. Not too many kids who need targeted interventions and not too many who need intensive interventions. Efficiency. So the relationship between the continued effort and the continued effectiveness is how we're defining efficiency here. And so you're always, the outcome you want to get to, the valued outcome you want to get to, is you want to think about the least amount of effort to get to that outcome. And so how can you continue to make things more and more efficient? What can help is getting things down on paper, having lesson plans, having schedules, having agendas, and going back to those efficient team meetings. There is I've been on a lot of different kinds of teams at the school level, and then the state level, and now at the federal level. I know you have been as well. And it can be fun to waste time. I've enjoyed some of it before, but it is, in the end, waste of time. And so using some of those tools that we talked about earlier to make them efficient meetings. Continuous regeneration. That is a term, I don't know where it started, but my understanding was it started with Rob Horner when I was doing my dissertation, and he asked me to look into it because I couldn't really find much on this. But it's grown since then. That was a while ago. And continuous regeneration, there's that fidelity, what's it called? The fidelity implementation depth. Fullen talks about it and others talk about it. And so, it's just human nature that things become less shiny and exciting after time, and they are looking for the new thing. And so how do you continue to make it interesting, exciting, and work for them? And these are some of the ideas of what you need to do. Using data, so if priorities are changing, then how are you going to respond to them? I know with the PBIS Center, equity has become more significant over time, and so they've used behavioral practices, they've used some of what is in the PBIS bag already to respond to equity needs, and they've done it effectively. And again, becoming more efficient over time. Connecting with the community of practice, and I would say a structured community of practice, because there are professional learning communities at schools that can be unstructured and can, again, lead to wasting time. So structuring it. What's your goal? Do you have an action plan? How are you going to do things? How much time are you going to spend on each thing, etc. So this is a little bit more on communities of practice and ways that you can network and share and gives you some good ideas, like inviting important stakeholders to these. So question, do you currently use a measure of sustainability? And if yes, what is it? I'm very interested. I'm also going to add the district capacity assessment and the driver's best practices assessment from, I meant to add it on a slide and then forgot about it. So the district capacity assessment and driver's best practices assessment are also sustainability assessments. So the district capacity assessments, obviously at the district level, these are both from CSEP, and the Michigan MyBlissy also supported the creation of the district capacity assessment. And the driver's best practices assessment, some of you have known from way back, but when you think about the implementation drivers, it's looking to see what's present in a school, and that is a capacity assessment at that level. So use the modified DCA, New Jersey. Great, that's helpful, thank you. So I wanted to introduce one other measure of sustainability. This is for the school team to plan for sustainability, and the Subsist checklist is from Kent McIntosh, and it's available publicly for free. And you can use this link to get to it. I think it's got 40 items, so it's quite long. You might look, and it is for PBIS, so you might look to make it more generalizable to your initiative. Okay, great. Thank you. So I'm going to keep on talking, but if you want to use the chat pod, could you use a checklist like Subsist with your site? Because one of my concerns about sustainability, why this came up for me and why it's now something that you are going to be talking about in your APR in Section C, is thinking about when you have to transition sites away from your project, either because your project is ending or because you've supported them for a certain amount of time and it's time for you to move on, hopefully because you've been very effective with them and they're ready to do it on their own. But just thinking through how you ensure they know how to continue on. So how are they going to get training? How are they going to get coaching? Are they going to know who to go to for that if you're not providing it for them anymore through the DIG? Do they have all the structures in place to support it? So all the things we've talked about that are important for sustainability, are they ready to do that on their own? And so I'd like us to think as a program altogether, as a network, about how we can be more planful about that moving forward. All right. What is more important to sustainability? It's a little quiz. Having a supportive administrator or having a strong implementation team? Oh, and I see from the last conversation, the tool to prompt discussions and planning about sustainability, but not a tool to measure it. We also use a district implementation monitoring tool. How they're doing moving the stages of implementation. Great. So strong team, both. Okay, great. And you got it right, but it's true that both are important. You need a supportive administrator and a strong team. The great thing about teams, as I said before, is that if the supportive administrator leaves, you still have the team. And if you can show that you have a way of working, that you have processes, and that you are having an impact, you're much more likely to be able to continue the initiative. And we talked about all this quite a bit. And that the district systems can enable administrators as well as teams. And I just talked about that. Sorry about that. Upcoming changes. So any questions before we move to upcoming changes? Any questions about sustainability or implementation teams, or talking about what you're doing in relation to both in your APR? Okay. Hopefully, I was clear as can be. So changes to the EBPD rubric. So I talked about early on that Program Measure 1 is likely going to change for next year's APR, and I want to give you a lot of preparation for that. The EBPD rubric is what you base your self-assessment score on for Program Measure 1 and what the contractors look at to give you a score for Program Measure 1. So the EBPD rubric is aged. It is from 2012, so it's been quite a while. And when we were having conversations a couple years back, we met as a program, so it would have been 2018. We met at the Project Directors Conference during the program area meeting, and we talked about some of the capacity building that needs to happen at the state, some infrastructure building that needs to happen at the state to support the work. And Scott Ross from Colorado brought up, I don't think this needs to be a long-term measure, which was how I thought at the time. I think this needs to be integrated into what we're already doing with the EBPD rubric. So some of that capacity building, some of the infrastructure, what to focus on could be integrated. And so I worked through some possible changes here and with the help of some of the project officers, and then some of the evaluators in the SIG network said, we have some ideas too. Can we take a crack at it? And I said, that would be great. And so they're currently working on that. They just met recently to make some recommendations. They're going to be sending that to me soon. And then CSEP also had some ideas, especially for the systems interventions and facilitative administration, so the E domain in that. And so we're getting changes from everywhere. So if you have ideas about what you want to change to the EBPD rubric, just go ahead and pull it down or use what you already have from the Program Measures webpage and use track changes and then send it to me. And I should say the project officers here will look together at it, and you'll be able to see some drafts before we finalize it. But we want to integrate what we've been learning from your experiences as well as what we're learning from implementation science and other areas. So that's why we're taking a look at the EBPD rubric again. Questions about that? Okay. So the new long-term program measure, as I said, I had originally been thinking this was going to be about state capacity building and infrastructure and how you support, how you make an effective professional development system, get some more aspects about that in there. But I've always been concerned that we didn't have information about child outcomes. Some projects talk about it, but not all projects talk about it in their APR. And I'm asked by Congress, well, I should say I'm asked by the Budget Office for information to provide to Congress every year about the impacts the digs are having. And Congress is unlikely to care so much about how effective your professional development systems are or how great the fidelity looks for your educators. I don't know that they think it doesn't matter, but that's not really what they're looking for. They're looking for the impact on child outcomes. And so that is one reason why we're going to have a child outcomes measure. The other reason it's the end, it's that final connection. You have a great professional development system, which increases adult use of the intervention, which should then impact child outcomes. So that's the whole picture. And so we're just really completing the picture. So we plan to have a child outcomes measure. So start thinking about your initiatives and think about what impact you expect them to have on the child. Hopefully you're already collecting that and you're just going to be using it as a program measure. If you're not, you can talk with your project officer. Project officer can also pull me in for the conversation since this is so new. But you're going to be talking about next year, you're going to be reporting on what your intervention means for child outcomes. Questions about that? All right, moving on. This I've given you, we've talked about before, but the program measures, we had our contractors who look at your program measures come in and talk both at the SPDIG National Meeting and then afterwards on a webinar, which is recorded and available on SIG Network, talked about some of the things that they were missing this year so that would enable them to fully assess or score your initiatives. And so that's something to look at again. But this year, your project officer is going to receive your draft program measures anytime now, but certainly by April 15th. Look at those draft program measures and then send back to you any changes. We just want to make sure that you are giving all the information the contractors need to review it. And you go ahead and use ChatPod for any questions as I move on. If you also want somebody else's feedback that is not your project officer, I will connect you with another state, and you all can share your worksheets and tell each other what might be missing, what you don't understand, because the contractor is, you know, the other SPDIG is not going to be fully novice. The contractor is not fully novice, but they don't know your project like you do. And so that's going to, if you're looking at something with a more objective eye, what's missing? What do you want to hear more about in the descriptions? So before I go on to the program measure overview, any questions about turning in your draft program measures? You want to share them or anything I said before that? Okay. So here's that external reviewers, the contractors webinar that I talked about improving your program measure submissions. Here are resources that are available to you on the program measures page. You can see you've got the worksheet, the exemplar I talked about earlier from Georgia, just their worksheet, not their whole APR. The rubric that the contractor, that you base your assessment of your descriptions on and that the contractor uses. And then there's an exemplar APR from Kansas, APR from Alabama, and then Alabama's final report. We have guidance for each of the program measures here. And then this rubric B, I pull out and have a link to as well. Rubric B is the description of all the information the contractors are going to be looking for in your APR. So it talks about the information you need to give about program measure 2. So the fidelity measure, your reliability work, et cetera, et cetera. So it takes you through all the steps of what you need to do to answer. So I highly recommend reviewing that as you're putting together your APR or beforehand. Rubric B. So here are the program measures. I'm going to go through these quickly because you all already know them. We've been doing it for years, but this program measure 1 is about evidence-based professional development practices. The components that we've had challenges, the program have had challenges on previously have been about the training, coaching, and observing of trainers. The SPDIG coaches using multiple sources of information to provide feedback to those being coached. Fidelity and student outcome data being shared regularly with stakeholders at multiple levels. Goals created for the implementation of student outcome data, goals with benchmarks, and that's sharing and celebrating successes. And we talked a little bit about that in the PBIS work, how important that is. Participants are instructed in how to provide data to the SPDIG project, so describing how you do that, even if you don't do it on a regular basis. How did you originally do it? But you really should be doing it on a regular basis as well. Leadership at various education levels, analyze feedback regarding barriers and successes, and make the necessary decisions and changes, including revising policies and procedures to alleviate barriers and facilitate implementation. So we talked about this, that that's an important part of the implementation team. So some of the specific issues that the contractors found is that they need data submission details. So how do you ask for data? How is it given to you for the different sites? Procedures for analyzing the data to recognize barriers. Describe the data systems and how data systems are aligned. So how does the school talk to the district data system to the state data system? Description of roles throughout all the different work that you do. How policies and procedures are changed to support a new way of work. So if you're doing MTSS, we talked about those different infrastructure things that need to happen. And so are there procedures that have had to be changed, or have you had a new policy in place? So say like a district improvement plan. That's a policy that you've integrated your work into, perhaps. And then just being careful about extraneous information. You've got to really meet the component description. And one way that you can do that is by bulleting out your worksheet. So the requirements of the component, taking those requirements, putting them into your section where you're doing the descriptions, and then having a description after each of the bullets just helps to organize the information, make sure you're responding to each of the requirements. Talked about using a novice reviewer to make sure that your descriptions are easy for an outside observer to understand, which can be done through a state review. I can connect you. So program measure 2 is about improving implementation over time. And just be real clear about the fidelity measure they're using. And don't assume that the reviewer understands it's a fidelity measure. Describe it as a fidelity measure. If it's a self-assessment of some kind, you have to describe an external person, not from that team, coming from outside and observing with the tool, and that 20% of your sites have to have that reliability check. If it's not a self-assessment, if it's already an outside observation, just describe that in your description and make it clear. And then we've talked a bit about setting your targets. If as you're putting together your APR, you're not meeting your target and you're far from meeting your target, or you're far over meeting your target, talk with your project officer about your target for next year and what will make the most sense. We want it to be challenging and achievable, considering your history and what the professional development you're going to be providing in the next year. You know, how are you going to fill in those gaps? You should be looking at your training and coaching and other aspects of your professional development system on what you can change to improve fidelity. What are the areas within fidelity that are the problems? But can you meet that target considering all you can do with professional development in your overall system? Program measure 3 is the cost measure. We had 100% on this last year, so I'm not going to get into it too much. So any questions before I go into the other APR considerations? Questions about the program measures and what to focus on this year? Okay, great. Overall APR considerations. So 1, large available balances. As part of the APR season, if you currently have a large available balance, you received an email from Larry Wexler with a form. You'll be filling out that form and attaching it to your APR this year. You may not end up having a large available balance once we review your APRs. At that point in time, it might not be over the target that we set, but you still have to fill out that SF 424 form. Does anyone have a question? I hear somebody's phone, so if you have a question, I will pause here. All right. Outcome measures. So I talked about congressional justification, how important it is. They're not required this year, but we still like to see them, especially if you're already collecting the child level impact data. There's no downside. You know, there's not. If you don't meet the target you said, it's fine. But we want to know about the impact it's having, and it helps us have a better conversation with you as project officers. if we can see the whole picture. So these are the things we talked about for the future changes. Talked about having a child outcome measure. We talked, oh, I did not talk about this yet. I'm glad that the slide is here. So change to program measure 2 is, my plan is to talk about intervention fidelity instead of implementation fidelity, because that's what we're going to ask you to provide. So we want to know for your program measure about fidelity of the intervention that impacts the child. So you've got a child outcome measure. You know that you should be impacting the child if you are using the fidelity or using the intervention that's meant to be used. You assess that with a fidelity measure. So it's an intervention fidelity measure. You can still keep other measures. So say you have a district team, a district measure of MTSS. So there's an MTSS team. You're measuring their fidelity. That's fine. You can keep that as a project measure, but you would have a program measure of what's happening that actually impacts the child level. Questions about that? Any thoughts about that?
So I couldn't keep quiet any longer. This is Peg.
Sure.
Um,
No, you're
I
always
was
welcome to
trying to be good about putting stuff in the chat box. I think I'm the only one that ever talks on these calls.
I love it when people use their phone, by the way.
Okay. So right now we have both.
Mm-hmm.
And I think so I guess, is it okay to have less in terms of measures and just focus on the one that's closest to the child?
If you're collecting the information anyway, it's really helpful. I'm going to speak for the other project officers. It's really helpful for project officers to be able to see that whole picture. Because, you know, once you can see, well, so how is, I'm going to go with the example I was using before. You have a district MTSS team. You have a school MTSS team. And then, you know, you have what's actually happening that's going to affect the child. If I can see all those different measures, I have such a better conversation with you. So I'd rather have all of that in the APR. And if you're already collecting the data, hopefully it's not too much more work to put it in there.
Okay. And then I'm going back to a question I put in the chat box a while ago. On the draft program measures to the project officer by April 15th, it's just the draft program measures. It's not the whole report, correct?
Right. Correct.
Okay, thank you. All right, I'll be quiet again.
No, speak up whenever you would like to.
Hi, this is Shelly Menendez.
Hi, Shelley.
I want to jump into, I actually started writing in the chat box, and I thought it's probably just better to say it out loud. In Iowa, I think we have been using intervention fidelity measure checklists in our K-6 strand, and I think what we're finding the challenge there is getting the teachers to do those fidelity checks because they're doing specially designed instruction. Oftentimes their interventions vary, and so getting them to kind of land on an intervention fidelity checklist is difficult, and I think it's just also sometimes difficult for them to self-assess the fidelity while they're doing it. So, you know, just put it out there, just because of the nature of that particular grant, you know, measuring the intervention fidelity is challenging. It's a work in progress. We're certainly doing it, and we're encouraging teachers to do it.
Right.
But when we look at our implementation components, that component of implementation tends to be the lowest.
Yeah, and that's interesting. Yeah, but I've liked what you've shown for fidelity before. I can't speak for Tara, your project officer, but it would make sense to me that when they're thinking about the various aspects, especially design instruction, and actually doing them, that would impact the child outcome. So I feel like you've done a good job of it so far, telling that story. And it might be that they're, you know, this is something that we're going to have to work out as we go along. Anything new like this, we'll have to make changes along the way. But I think that if you have different intervention fidelity assessments and you know what fidelity means for each of them, then it's about, have these different practitioners met fidelity, and then the percentage of them that have, and maybe not all on the same measure. So I think that there'll be some aspects that we might need to work out for certain ones, and there'll be a conversation, and
Yep.
then we'll learn from you, and then we'll make changes along the way. So in this next year, my understanding is that we'll have it as a pilot measure, and that's how we'll learn together about it. So it won't be a true program measure. We won't be using it for our GEPRA. You'll be providing us the information as a way for us to learn about how to shape it over time. Good. These are great questions. All right. So anything, and this was so much information, so much new. There are no, I think that I usually don't like it when people say there are no dumb questions, but there are no dumb questions for this because it was just a lot and a lot of changes. All right. So just a couple things. Like I said, I'm not going to get in depth on the APR because none of you are new to this, but I wanted to point out a few things. One, when you are going into your final year, you create a final performance report, and that's due within 90 days after the final day of your grant. If you're going to be asking for a no-cost extension, then you would email your project officer who would make sure that you give them the paperwork and they make the changes in the situation. But one way or another, even if you're asking for no cost extension or you're doing a final performance report, you're most likely going to have to give us an APR in May anyways. In no cost extension, absolutely. Final performance report, if you're an October 1 start date, which most of you are, you would still give us a May annual performance report because we have to have one on file for you every 12 months, just about. So that's just an overall ed-wide requirement. Don't forget to check that it's an annual performance report or a final performance report, whatever it happens to be. You all know this pretty well. So again, make sure you label program measures and project measures appropriately. That's a big one. So one of the things I don't see people doing is following these guidelines in the explanation of progress section. So that little description box that goes underneath the status chart, I don't see people following these directions. So it's supposed to describe the data that it provided, the data collection methods, when were the data collected, how was the sample drawn, are there missing incomplete data, response rates, reliability measure. And then you talk about changes in the data that occurred since the last APR, so is there any trend information, activities undertaken to achieve the targets, if the targets are not met, possible reasons, and how will activities that fail to meet the targets be improved? So these are some great questions. You just have to look in the directions, and it comes with the overall package that you just received. And you see that explanation of progress section of the status chart. Section B, there are instructions about how to fill in that budget section, and of course there are instructions for section C, and I added to those this year with the sustainability and implementation teams. Here are the budget questions. You're supposed to provide actual expenditures for the reporting period, an explanation if you did not expend funds at the expected rate. This is critical, especially if you have a large available balance. And even if you don't have a large available balance now, you could have one when you turn in your APR. We use Section B, we project officers use Section B to talk to leadership about why you should continue to receive your requested amount of continuation funding. So this is a really critical section. So you would provide an explanation if you did not expend your funds at expected rate, An expected rate is whatever you put in your application about what you are going to spend in the year. Describe any significant changes to your budget resulting from modifications to project activities. So say you lost a site or you gained a district, that would change your budget. You'd explain that. Describe any changes to your budget that affected your ability to achieve your approved project activities. So some of these have a little overlap. Do you expect to have any unexpended funds at the end of the current budget period? So you might not have gone on the expected rate, but maybe you're going to catch up. So you would talk about that. If you're not going to catch up, what do you think you're going to have left over, and then how are you going to use it in future years? And then this one, describing what's going to require prior approval. I doubt that you're going to know about that, but if you do, you would describe it here. This is section C, so it talks about your current partners to the grant, any changes to those partners, anything that's happened with those partners, and if it's influencing your ability to achieve your objectives. And then any changes that you wish to make in the grants activities you can talk about here, although typically you're going to be communicating with your project officer prior to the APR, so this would just be a way of saying, hey, my project officer said it's okay to do this, and then you've got it in writing forever in your APR. You use G5, talks about no cost extensions, and then you can work with your project officer for any other questions you have about that. I did tack on the slides about project objectives and performance measures and how to have good performance measures, strong ones. I'm not going to go over it right now because, again, none of you are novices at this, but just know that it's part of the PowerPoint slides in case you ever need to use it for new people who come onto your project. Any questions or thoughts? All right, hearing none, I will go ahead and close this off. Lynn, thank you so much for your help today. The slides are available on the event page on SIG Network. We have that program measures page you might want to look over. And then, of course, all those resources that I talked about with teams and sustainability are part of the PowerPoint slides, and you can open those up and just click through. Thank you for for sticking with me throughout this and for your good questions and for the information you provided in the chat pod. I appreciate it. And have a great afternoon.